Over the past few months, we've come back several times to the situation in Palestine, the reality of life on the ground for people inside Gaza, the emotional toll of the war, the situation inside Israel. We've analysed the way the conflict is portrayed in the media, and we've brought on leading experts to discuss these potentially hugely consequential cases that are making their way through the highest international courts. Through it all, we've tended to steer clear of looking too closely at the history of the conflict. And the reason for that, particularly during the Gaza war, is that there's simply so much history, and it's so contested, that trying to cover it all over a few episodes of the podcast would seem like a fool's errand. Having said that, sometimes the history of a particular moment can shed light on the current situation, and a newly published book tries to do that, offering fresh insight into what's happening now by looking at a very particular moment in history then. I say moment, but really it's looking at a particular friendship. An Impossible Friendship by Sonja Mejcher-Atassi takes as its subject a group of friends in Jerusalem in the mid-1940s and looks at what we can learn from their relationship at that critical time in the history of the conflict. My colleague Rasha Elass spoke to Sonja for the podcast. They talked about what was a very real friendship in post-war Jerusalem, one that, however, seems impossible to us today. They talked about the wider context of the book and what it says about the modern conflict. And they talked about how Sonja, as a writer, used the past as a window to the present. I'm Faisal Yafai. Here is this week's episode of The Lead.
Sonja, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
In your book, Impossible Friendship, you focus on the lives of 5 people who come from diverse backgrounds, and they happen to find themselves together in Palestine during World War II. And you anchor their intersecting life stories in the iconic King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Can you paint a picture for us on the tensions that were playing out at that time in Palestine and the significance of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem?
Thank you. Sure. So the King David Hotel, they mainly met there for drinks. They used to meet at the bar of the King David Hotel. The King David Hotel was and continues to be just across the street from the YMCA. It was certainly a place for an elite to meet. So this was also a group, an intellectual elite, even though some of the individuals come from different social background. The King David Hotel served as the headquarters for the British Mandate. So you would have a lot of British civil servants, also soldiers who would come there on a daily basis to go to their office, but also to the restaurants, to the bar, to meet. So it was certainly a place where there was a lot of things happening if you wanted to know the last kind of gossip, but also be part of what was being talked about politically, about the future of Palestine. This was the place to go.
Yeah, give us an idea of the historic context leading up to the terror attack on the King David Hotel.
When we go back to 1948, we are confronted with a battle over memories, over different narratives. And so for me, it was very important to reconstruct, as I said, in fragments, these everyday lives. Now, the King David Hotel, and my book actually starts with that, is known today primarily for the bombing in July 1946, which was carried out by the Irgun, an offshoot of the Haganah. And the friends actually came together at the hotel the evening before the bombing. So symbolically speaking, we can really say that it is that bombing, that terrorist attack, that made their friendship impossible. Yeah, so this bombing on July 22nd, 1946, really sent shock waves across Palestine and the entire region, because this kind of warfare, these kind of terrorist attacks were new, and there were over 90 people who were killed in this bombing, among them Arabs and Jews, and also British civil servants and soldiers. As I said, they had their offices, their headquarters there. We have to remember also that these categories, Arabs and Jews, are not cut in stone. So these categories were really coming into existence at that time. So really through British imperial policy in the Middle East, whereas before they could have been aligned with other identities, be it Ottoman or Syrian or Palestinian or Iraqi, and also they could have been aligned with each other. So to really separate, if you want, the population of Palestine into Arabs and Jews really is, if you want, an outcome, an invention of British imperial policy in the region.
Yeah, you notice in that part of the world, identity is a lot more fluid and categories are a lot less rigid. I also came upon in your book, you quote a headline from what was then the largest Arabic newspaper at the time, called Palestine. And it says, as the King David Hotel was becoming more and more prominent in Jerusalem, it said, King David Hotel, a network of Zionist networks to eliminate Arabs economically. A lot of the local population, the local Arab population, felt economically disenfranchised and excluded from everything that was the King David Hotel and all the economic activity surrounding it. Can you talk a little bit?
Certainly. So that article goes back to when the King David Hotel opened in the early 30s. And it's interesting to see that already then it was perceived critically, right? So certainly the interior design, it's very Orientalist. Also, there was a clear hierarchy in terms of the staff. So the hotel manager, I think at the beginning, was a Swiss guy. Then you had Jewish, again, we have to keep in mind that these categories are problematic, Jewish and Arab, Palestinian workers, and you had the Sudanese waiters. And in descriptions of the King David, they are always described in very Orientalist, if not racist jargon. So as these kind of very exotic figures. And we forget that they had names and lives, just as, the guests who would come to the King David Hotel, the elite who would go. And actually, the King David Hotel was frequented by also the Palestinian elite. So many people would go there to meet, to just read the newspaper, you name it.
But in general, just tell us if it was a boon for the economy of Jerusalem.
So the King David Hotel was the first 5-star hotel, very luxurious. It was modeled after similar hotels in Egypt. So certainly it kind of stood for the new city, the modern city. We also have to understand that at the time, Jerusalem was not yet divided into East and West Jerusalem. Salim Tamari, in his book, he has a book called Jerusalem 1948. And in this book, he gives a description of Jerusalem as an ordinary city. So this is important that we remember that Jerusalem, like other cities in the Arab world, was not divided into East and West Jerusalem, but into the old city, in this case, the holy city, the third holiest place after Mecca and Medina in Islam. So the holy city, the old city, and the new city. So already in the late 19th century, so in Ottoman times, late Ottoman times, and early 20th century, people who could afford it would move out of the old city and construct villas with gardens in the new city. And we can say the King David Hotel, which opened in the early 30s, was part of that movement, but certainly also it came with an agenda, right? To get tourists who want to see the holy city. And it came with an agenda that favored the Zionist movement with British backing.
In Impossible Friendship, you refer to something called ecumenical friendship. And it's an interesting term. Elaborate on it for us.
Yeah, sure. So it's actually Walid Khalidi who, in an article about al-Baturani, refers to this group of friends as an economical circle. And this is important because my main characters, if you want, my protagonists, who are all real life people taken out of real life, come from different religious backgrounds. So maybe here, let me briefly introduce them. So there's the group picture, a photograph, which figures on my book cover. In this book cover, in this picture, you see 5 friends. I sometimes like to refer to them as my famous 5. You see them sitting together. The picture was actually taken at the Arab College in Jerusalem, which was the highest Arab educational institution before 1948, and which was run, the director was Walid Khalidi's father, Ahmad Sameh al-Khalidi. So this group of friends very often also met on that campus in the garden of the Khalidi's house, which was on the premises of the Arab College. They also met in the bar, as we discussed earlier, of the King David and some other venues, places across Jerusalem. So in this picture, you see in the middle Wolfgang Hildesheimer, who was of German Jewish background, and he came to Palestine in 1933 when the Nazis came to power in Germany. He was still a teenager. We were still going to school. He came with his parents. So this is when he came to Jerusalem, and he would later take a distance from the German Zionist circles of his parents, and he made friends with the British and with Palestinians in Jerusalem. And this is when he became very close friends with Walid Khalidi and Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, who figure also in this picture. So Walid Khalidi is known as today as a towering figure, really, in scholarship. He is a world-renowned historian of Palestine, also very important for institution building. He co-founded the Institute for Palestine Studies in 1961 in Beirut, and diplomacy. Back then, he was a young man. He was the youngest in the group. He was barely 18. He was interested in literature, writing some poetry. They were all aspiring artists and writers at the time. Jabra Ibrahim Jabra is of Syriac background, so it's very interesting. The 3 men, we have a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian. So Jabra was of Syriac background. His parents actually had fled the region of Adana in the early 20s, so after the demise of the Ottoman Empire and the genocide that took place in that region against Armenians and also Christians. So his family fled to Bethlehem. He was very young at the time, so he was actually born in Adana, but then grew up in Bethlehem, and he was a student. Later, he became a scholarship, was a student at the Arab College. Of course, today, Jabra Ibrahim Jabra is known as really a driving force of Arab modernism. After 48, he went to Baghdad and he became one of the key modern representatives of modern Palestinian literature. Let me just briefly go back to Wolfgang, and then I'll say something about the two women in the picture. Wolfgang, like Jabra and Walid, was really an aspiring, as I said, artist, writer, intellectual at the time. And he had left Palestine to study in London in the 30s, 37, but then came back because of the outbreak of World War II to Jerusalem. And this is really when he came back from London, which was such a cosmopolitan hub. This is when he really took a distance from the German Zionist circles of his parents. And he always felt very strongly that his place was in Europe and not in Palestine. So after the end of World War II, he returned first to London and then from there to Germany, where he worked as an interpreter in the Nuremberg trials. And then he stayed in Germany, later settled in Switzerland. And he became really very well known in German post-World War II German language literature. So he and Jabra really became these key figures, one in modern Arabic literature and the other in German language literature. Now, the two women, it's also interesting that I come to them a bit later because researching this group of friends certainly wasn't easy. When you write about women or research the lives of women, you're confronted with a lot of silences and gaps in the archive. So I didn't find as many documents about the woman as I did about the man, but I did find some. So let me start with Rasha Salam. In the pictures, he's sitting between Wolfgang and Jabra. So she's from a very prominent Lebanese family, the Salams. And her sister, Anbara Salam Khalidi, was married to Walid's father. So there's an age difference of 20 years between the two sisters. So Rasha would very often go from Beirut to Jerusalem to visit her sister Anbara, who was really like a mother to her. So she knew Walid as a child. And then when they became young adults, they did fall in love and they later married and so on. So this just very briefly about Rasha Salam. So from one of the really big and influential Lebanese Beiruti families who championed Arab nationalism and the emancipation of women. Seli Kassab, her father was also from Beirut, her mother from Jerusalem, and she grew up partly in England and partly in Jerusalem. She's of Greek Orthodox background. And Sally and Wolfgang were known in Jerusalem as a couple. So they later each went their own ways, but at the time they were known as a couple. So it's also very interesting because this group of friends, and certainly there were more other friends on the fringes, but this was really, if you want, a core. They were very, very close. They met. I so often discussed their writings, their feelings, their ideas about the future of Palestine. So they were very close, but certainly there were many other people also on the fringes of this group.
Yeah, I want to go back to this idea of the ecumenical friendship, because I want to clarify, I think, an important point about the book. You know, given that this group of friends, they come from very distinctly different cultural backgrounds and worldviews, I feel that the book is not really about, oh, look, a Jewish person and a Muslim person and a Christian person, they're friends. Wow, it's amazing. Why can't we have peace? I just feel it's a very rich compilation of how each character, representing their own distinct cultural history and worldview, interacted with each other and with their context and influenced their context and each other back and forth in a heart-tickling way. Is Russia's sort of love triangle. I love the whole interaction with, you know, the man who would become her husband and, let's say, the other man. Just tell us a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah. So, first of all, to go back to the ecumenical. So, I think what's interesting here is that, yes, it just shows us that these were very cosmopolitan years. So, while World War II was raging across Europe and certainly also in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, actually, people were, to some extent, I mean, there was conflict. I mean, we had the uprising, the general strike, 36 to 39, just before the outbreak of World War II, which was brutally crushed by the British. So the Arab uprising against the British mandate and their support of the Zionist movement. And this uprising was really brutally crushed by the British. And that also had an impact then on the outcome of events in 1948, because the political elite was sent into exile. Many people were killed, injured, and so on. But now I'm jumping back a bit in time. But I think what is important to understand is that people, especially in Jerusalem, but also in other cities across Palestine, Haifa in particular, were very much mixing with each other, right? And they were colleagues, they were friends, they were neighbors. And so there were lots of friendly relations, even though friendship, this is what Walid Khalidi told me, in that generation already did become, how do you say, rarer. So the generation of his father, the friendship was much more common among Palestinians, Arabs, and Jews. So after the Balfour Declaration, so we can really say since the generation after 1917, friendship became more difficult or more strained. But for this intellectual elite, certainly, the years of World War II, al-Baturani would actually describe it as the years of fragile tranquility. So they were having more or less a good time in Jerusalem. And Wolfgang Hildesheimer also writes about this later, that it was really only when he returned to Europe, and then especially when he worked in Germany at the Nuremberg trials as an interpreter, that he was confronted with the horrors of the Holocaust. So before, in Jerusalem, people were hearing this and that, but it's only when he returned to Europe and worked as an interpreter in the Nuremberg trials that he was really confronted with the horrors of the Holocaust. But now to Rasha and Wolfgang, yes. So it seems like this group of friends, everyone in the larger group, everyone was kind of having a crush on everyone. These were young people, right? They were trying to have a good time. They were going out together. They were reading T.S. Eliot. They were discussing politics. They were discussing literature, modern art. They were very much into Jabra and Wolfgang, very much into surrealism. Also, we have to keep in mind that Rasha writes about this love for Wolfgang, or her feelings, her emotions towards Wolfgang, later. So she started writing her memoirs, which remain unpublished. And it's in her memoirs, which Walid Khalidi kindly gave me access to, that she writes, or she contemplates what maybe her life could have looked like, what would have happened had she married Wolfgang and not Walid. So, and then certainly in the archives, I looked for traces of that love, but I did not find many explicit references. Certainly, they must have been very close. She started then also in the 1980s. So imagine 40 years after they split, right? So with the Nakba 1948, the creation of the State of Israel, and the first Arab-Israeli war, they were dispersed really across the world. And it's 40 years later, in the 80s, that she starts a correspondence with Wolfgang. They did meet again shortly in the 50s. They did visit each other in Oxford and Germany. So 40 years later, and in the 80s, she starts this correspondence, and I found these letters in the archives. And in these letters, it becomes clear that they had a very close friendship. And, you know, the border between friendship and love is a bit fluid. So while she's asking him for help to remember really their common lives back in Palestine before 1948. So my book, the main part really is, as I said, this reconstruction of their everyday lives and intimacies in Jerusalem before 48. And then the second shorter part is about the afterlife or the afterlives of that friendship. So their attempts at reconnecting later on. And here I was very happy in the archives to find letters, right? So these letters between Rasha and Wolfgang, but also Jabra. Later, already he was in Baghdad, then obtained a scholarship to go from the Rockefeller Foundation to spend a year at Harvard. And while at Harvard, he sends a letter to Wolfgang in Germany and tries to reconnect and really tells Wolfgang what happened to him in 1948. And he tells him that literally he was made a refugee in 1948.
Yeah, and there's an interesting essay you quote from Jabra's essay that titled "The Palestinian Exile as Writer, the Wandering Palestinian." And he says, a historical horror, which over the centuries had acquired the force of a myth, seemed after 1948 to come alive again. It was ironic that the new wanderers should be driven into the wilderness by the old wanderers themselves.
Thank you for citing this essay, which I love. And I always feel that Jabra didn't get enough credit for it, because what he's principally, saying is that the Palestinians are the victims of the victims. And this is what Edward Said said in his book, The Question of Palestine, which was published after Jabra's essay. And I'm sure that Edward Said did read Jabra's essay. Also, you see some common ideas between Jabra and Said in also Reflections on Exile, Said's essay on exile, which he wrote in 1984. Jabra's essay, I think, was published in 78. I think this is very important to point out this relation between this entanglement is a better word, this entanglement between the Palestinian exile and the Jewish, the German, European Jewish exile. I think this is very important. And for me, it was very interesting really tracing the trajectories of these 5 friends allowed me to read together, not in comparison, but as entangled, linked histories, the Holocaust and the Nakba, because they do come together in their trajectories. I mentioned earlier Hildesheimer, so who kind of saw, if you want, the years that led up to the Nakba, experienced those years firsthand in Palestine, and then goes back to Europe and then is confronted in retrospect working as an interpreter in the Nuremberg process with the horrors of the Holocaust. And then while he's working at Nuremberg and, then decides to stay in Germany, then 1948 happens and he's following these events, this catastrophe from Germany. It's also interesting to point out that Wolfgang, he obtained a Palestinian passport, as did all really Jewish immigrants to Palestine issued by the British Mandate. So he obtained that passport, I think, in 36, 37. And this is when he left with that passport, which enabled him to travel. He left to study in London. So he had a Palestinian passport from 1937 to 1948. And when the Nakba happened, so he was already back in Europe, but his parents and his sister stayed. And they did become Israelis. So there's also the exchange of letters he had then with his parents. And we see that they had different opinions, that there was tension. His positions were not always very clear, but this is also, I think, a reminder for us that we are dealing with real life people and people are not black and white, right? And people also change. So, and we see that in the course of his life, that he also changed positions. But yes, he was known among this group of friends really as being very critical of Zionism. And after 48 also, he refused to take Israeli citizenship. So he was left without a passport, and it took him 4 years. He was trying to get a British passport, a German passport. It took a while for him to get a German passport. And then he left Germany again in the 50s because he felt, for various reasons, but among them also that he felt there were still too many Nazis around in Germany. And then he settled in Switzerland, in Poschiavo, which is a very remote village, almost in Italy. So you feel really at the end of the world. And this is where he then stayed for the rest of his life, 30 years. And he did actually then give up his German citizenship and applied for Swiss citizenship. So that is also very interesting kind of to see the role identity papers, passports, and so on play, and how, because he's so well known, as I said, in post-World War German language literature, but his time in Palestine is really understudied. And, from 33 to 46, so he spent a significant amount of time in Palestine.
Yeah, absolutely. His life story is fascinating. He bears witness to the Holocaust from Palestine, reading about it in the press in English, and then becomes an interpreter at the Nuremberg trials. And then from Europe, where he moves to in 1948, then he bears witness to the Nakba through the sort of personal accounts of his own friends. It's just so fascinating. I love also that you shared a quote from Virginia Woolf about how a biography is considered complete if it merely accounts for 6 or 7 selves, whereas a person may well have as many thousands.
Yeah, I love that quote, and I love her writing. So yes, certainly deciding to write a group biography or any biography, really, we make choices. We see people maybe as we like to see them, and there are things we zoom in on and there are things we leave out. So certainly each one of them, we could show them in very different constellations with other people later in life, other groups of friends, colleagues, and that would show them in a completely different life. So life writing is fascinating, but it's also difficult, and it comes with a lot of challenges. I mentioned the question of archives earlier. So for me, this was also really intriguing because, here I was in Beirut and working on a group of friends in Jerusalem. So you would think that the papers, archives should take me to Jerusalem, but then the archives really took me everywhere outside, to Baghdad, to Switzerland, to Germany, to the UK, to the US. And there are many reasons for this. In particular, that Palestinian archives are as dispersed as Palestinians themselves, right? In 1948, a lot of material was destroyed, was looted. Some was lost, some ended up stolen in Israeli state archives. And some families and individuals managed to take some material, carry it with them into the various exiles they lived in after 1948. So this is a big difference also when you work on Western literature. So for Wolfgang Hildesheimer, it was very easy. I went to the Academy of Arts in Berlin and I had, I don't know how many folders. Everything was neatly classified. There were friendly people who helped me pull out this, pull out that. So I found a lot of material there. But then when it comes to the Palestinian lives, things look very differently. Jabra's case is maybe extreme, but he managed to carry with him into exile in Baghdad some personal items, papers, and certainly all his later correspondence. He kept everything, and a big library and the collection of modern art from the region, Palestinian and Iraqi. But then his house, which his family kept after his death, turned into what is often called collateral damage in the aftermath of the Iraq War. So it was completely destroyed. And so all of his papers, letters are destroyed. So I don't know, for example, if Wolfgang ever responded to Jabra. I mentioned his letter that Jabra sent to Wolfgang in the 50s from Harvard. I don't know if Wolfgang responded. Maybe he did, but that letter is gone if he did. So, yeah.
And you highlight how for Jabra it was very important for him that he doesn't identify himself as a refugee. And I love this quote from Darwish, which you attribute to the sister of the teacher, one of the teachers of Jabra. My homeland is not a suitcase. I am not a traveler. I am a lover, and the land is my beloved.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, for Jabra, it was very important. And I think for Darwish, similarly, later, to not be called a refugee. And this is something we see also. We talked earlier about German Jewish exile, for example, Hannah Arendt, her writing in the early 40s, her essay, We Refugees. So Jabra really considered himself and his Palestinian co-wanderers as knowledge peddlers. And I like that term a lot because I think this is really what he and what they were. And we've seen this across the Arab world and in particular in Beirut, where the Palestinians really contributed to Beirut turning into this hub for cosmopolitan life and modern literature and art and culture, you name it, right? So many Palestinians actually contributed tremendously to Arab and global modernism and the flourishing of these other Arab capitals, be it Beirut or Baghdad in the 50s.
Yeah, absolutely. In the introduction to Impossible Friendship, you say that all biographical writing is partly autobiographical. So, how does that relate to how you came about this book?
Yeah, so first of all, I've been living in Beirut really for more than half of my life. So it's been a long time. And I always grew up hearing so many stories about Beirut. So certainly I was very curious kind of to learn more about Beirut, but also Jerusalem. And I was actually, so I was working on Jabra Ibrahim Jabra. I had already worked on Jabra for my PhD, and I wanted to go back to working on Jabra. And it was really by coincidence I was walking across campus, the campus of the American University of Beirut, where I work, when I ran into my colleague Tarif Khalidi, who is Walid Khalidi's younger half brother. And he asked me, "What are you working on?" "Oh, this is so exciting," he said. "You're working on Jabra. You should meet my brother Walid." So next time Walid came to Beirut, I met with him. And it was Walid who mentioned for the first time I heard about this group of friends. But then it was only later when I had a sabbatical and I was in Berlin that I looked more into Wolfgang Hildesheimer, visited his archive at the Academy of Arts, and then came across the correspondence he had with Rasha in the 1980s, found his letters that Jabra sent to him. And then I became so intrigued by this group of friends that I let go of the book on Jabra and decided to write a group biography instead. And partly I did this because I felt that this group of friends, despite them being an intellectual elite, allowed me to kind of look at a larger picture. So in a way, this group picture serves as a lens to shed light on a much larger picture, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, which also goes back to before 1948. So kind of teaching myself or trying to understand through really personal stories this complex history, which I think is very important because I don't want to say I'm fed up with history, but I think we do need more names and faces and personal stories. I think these stories matter. And I also want to point out that I finished this book before October 7 and the current war on Gaza, which the ICG has ruled a plausible genocide. So I finished the book before, but I do think that, or I hope that my book is as much about our present and our future as it is about the past, because I think that past really is important. So it matters. We know that what is happening today, that there is a context for this, that this goes back 75, if not more years, 100 years. And I think it is very important to go back to this context and to look at the everyday also. So not only to look at the politicians and the big names and the big events, but to try to reconstruct everyday lives. And to do that also through friendship, I think is important, because friendship is something that also in scholarship and it has been somewhat left outside. We don't usually talk about it. We don't look about it. Maybe we study people, we have some family histories, biographies through the generations, but we don't really look much at friendship. And I think there's a lot to do in this respect.
Wonderful. Sonja, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to talk with you about my book and about Palestine before and after 1948. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Sonja Mejcher-Atassi's book, An Impossible Friendship, is out now and available online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar and hosted by Rasha Elass. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.